key thing is that what we're seeing from President Obama is a plan that is almost entirely military, even when he himself is saying there is no military solution. What we need is a diplomatically based solution that starts with do no harm, stop the plans for airstrikes, and stop sending more troops. We already have boots on the ground. There are, right now, somewhere around 1,500. There will be close to 1,800 very soon. So that's number one, do no harm. The next steps all have to do with diplomacy. So the U.S. should be engaging in a much more direct, open, and public way with Iran on the question of persuading the Iraqi government to move towards a more inclusive kind of government. We've heard talk about this. We've heard from the new Prime Minister, al-Abadi, that he intends to do that. That's all fine. But so far, there is no new director of the ministries, either for military or intelligence and security affairs. That's where the repression of Sunnis that has been so dramatic and has led to Sunni support for ISIS has come from. So we need real pressure, and that can best come from the combination of the U.S. and Iraq working together. Third, we need diplomacy where the U.S. will work again with Russia. This is a moment when there's enormous tension between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine, but this might be a moment for resolving some of that tension by reclaiming the good relations that were built last year between the U.S. and Russia in dealing with the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal. Then we need a broader diplomatic mobilization that has to go back to what was tried at the UN. It didn't work. We need to try again for real regional and global mobilization diplomatically to end the war in Syria. That has to come back to number 5, which is a massive campaign towards disarming this area. We need an arms embargo, and that's only going to happen if it happens on all sides. It's either all sides or none. So the U.S. and its allies need to stop arming these massive numbers of opposition forces in Syria. That will give them a better position to be able to pressure Russia and Iran to stop arming the Syrian regime. And finally, a massive increase in the amount of humanitarian support that the U.S. is providing. That kind of a policy is what we should have heard from Obama the other night. Unfortunately, what we heard was a 4-part military strategy, which is absolutely not going to work.
And Phyllis Bennis, why do you think it is that this time President Obama has laid out a military strategy and not considered diplomatic options? And last year, in August, following the chemical weapons attack, he backed down from his threat to strike militarily. What happened in the intervening time?
Yeah, well, I think, unfortunately, much of this is politically driven. There were moments of crisis in Iraq, as there had been moments of crisis in Syria, where there was the question of would the U.S. intervene militarily. One of the big problems is we don't hear options. We hear the choice that George Bush gave the nation on September 12th, after the September 11th attacks back in 2001, when we were told the choice is either we go to war or we let them get away with it. Presented with those two options, the support for going to war was 88%. And that's not so surprising. If the only alternative is do nothing, people will support war. The problem is all of the options that have to do with diplomacy, with disarmament, with arms embargoes, none of that was on the table. This time around, we saw an immediate response, partly around the humanitarian crisis that was happening on Mount Sinjar, although we were told a story that turned out not to be true. There were not 30,000 people starving on the mountain. There were about 3,000. Most had already been safely escorted off the mountain, not because of U.S. airstrikes, but because of the work of the Syrian Kurds who escorted them down the mountain through Syria and then back into Iraq. And then we had the political response to the horrific crime of ISIS when they beheaded 2 American journalists. This was a horrifying act, but it was not a threat to the United States. And the reality was that the politics is what then came to the fore. And the politics of revenge, very much like 9/11, the politics of revenge took over. And there was this fear in Washington, I think, of looking like we weren't doing anything, because anything is always described as anything military. So if there's going to be a response, it has to be a military response because we don't have another. We don't take seriously responses that are diplomatic, that are somehow non-military. And I think that that led to, particularly because of the press coverage that hyped the horror of this, as if it was the only time that such horrific acts had been taking place. The New York Times was the only mainstream media outlet that reported on, it was either August 27th or 28th, reported that the Free Syrian Army, the so-called moderate part of the Syrian rebels, who the U.S. wants now to increase aid and military support and training and arming, that the Free Syrian Army had itself beheaded 6 captives, 6 prisoners that they had control of. They beheaded them right after shooting to death, right after the shooting death of an American who had been caught by ISIS. So this is a war when war crimes, these kinds of acts of utter brutality, are taking place on all sides. And the idea that in response to that, that there will be a military response, that we will go to war against a criminal act, a horrific criminal act, simply is not going to work any better than it did back in 2001.